Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Labor Day weekend is now upon us. I'm Kailey Leinz, and of course, here on Balance of Power, where we follow politics, we do know that historically it's after Labor Day that we consider summer over, and in an election cycle, the sprint toward Election Day is on. But of course, this cycle has been unlike cycles in the past. I think we all know that. Of course, it began as the longest general election campaign in history when both Donald Trump and Joe Biden had their party's nominations locked up after Super Tuesday. And then it got flipped upside down entirely when, now almost 6 weeks ago, Joe Biden left the race and Kamala Harris took the helm as the Democratic nominee. And to just underscore how quickly and how significantly this game has changed since, look to Bloomberg's new polling with Morning Consult. Of course, looking at the key 7 battleground states in which we find she is up 2 points on Donald Trump across them, leading him in 6 of the 7. The 7th, Arizona, they are in a dead heat, literally tied. So for more details on this poll, Bloomberg's Gregory Korte joins me. He spent all of yesterday pouring through the numbers. And of course, it is the headlines that stand out here, Gregory. We're looking at 4-point leads in Nevada and Pennsylvania, which is a must-win state, and even 8 points up in Wisconsin.
Yeah, this is a pretty good poll for Kamala Harris. It builds on what we saw last month when she first entered the race. She's built on that a little bit, 1 percentage point overall across the 7 states, which isn't anything to put too much of an emphasis on. That's within the margin of error. But as you point out, her worst state is a state that she's tied with Donald Trump in, and that's Arizona. And then you go all the way up through a number of states that are within the margin of error to Wisconsin, which has always been a good Democratic state. Now it's a solid Democratic state, at least as the map looks now. And as you point out, Pennsylvania, all eyes on that keystone state, which is the keystone to this election. It is the what we call the tipping point state. Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine either candidate getting to 270 electoral votes without winning Pennsylvania. And as of now, Kamala Harris seems to have the edge there.
Well, and it's not just having the edge in the overall question around who these voters would cast a vote for with president, but also they're thinking on the issues and what issues they trust each of these candidates with, because we're seeing some pretty marked change from what Joe Biden frankly had distrust in that Kamala Harris seems to have more trust in when it comes to the economy.
That's the most remarkable thing about this poll. We've been doing this tracking poll for 11 months now, starting last October. We'll do 2 more in September and this October. But what we saw here is a pretty marked break from how voters perceived Joe Biden when he was still in the race and how they're perceiving his vice president, Kamala Harris, on issue after issue, especially on the economy. Kamala Harris is outperforming where Joe Biden was just 2 months ago. Voters trust her more on issues like housing costs, on pay raises, on employment, personal debt like student loans and credit cards, interest rates. On a lot of those things I just mentioned, she's actually polling higher than Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And she's narrowing the gap on that all-important who do you trust on the inflation question, which voters have told us time and time again is the single most important economic issue. And we're seeing it not just in the economic issues, but in issues like Gaza. Mm-hmm. We've been talking about how, and the vice president addressed this in her interview last night, whether or not she would make a change in U.S. policy in Gaza, certainly swing state voters and especially Democrats are giving her the benefit of the doubt on that issue. So she's really swiped the slate clean. And I like how you put it before. We went from the longest presidential election in history to really what's become the shortest. Yeah. This is a brand new race. And really, I think we should just maybe just agree to let's all forget about Joe Biden. He's still the president of the United States. He still has to govern, right? But from this point forward, it's really Harris versus Trump, and any baggage that Joe Biden brought to this race is pretty much gone in the minds of most swing state voters.
Well, that does seem like it may create a strategic problem for Donald Trump, who had spent months going after Joe Biden, specifically in the Biden administration's policies. Is there any good news for the Republican nominee in this poll, Gregory?
Well, Kamala Harris did not get a post-convention bounce. That's what we were all looking for. And if we had the traditional rhythms, the traditional ups and downs of a campaign cycle, you would have expected Trump to get a bounce out of his convention and Harris to get a bump out of hers. But remember, Trump almost got killed going into his convention.
Yeah.
Rode a big high, and then 2 days after the convention, Joe Biden drops out and permanently changed the race. For Kamala Harris, she came into the election with riding a big wave of enthusiasm. She's still on her sort of honeymoon. So if you're Donald Trump, you're hoping that honeymoon ends. You're hoping that interviews like last night's interview with CNN will somehow find a way to trip Harris up. I didn't hear that happen last night. Certainly, if you're looking for policy detail from her, you probably didn't hear it.
Yeah.
But she also probably didn't do herself a whole lot of damage. So now all eyes are on that September 10th debate on ABC in Philadelphia. And that's where Trump is going to try to change the dynamic of this race back again to try to seize the advantage. This race is still on a razor's edge. It's anyone's to win. But at least according to our polling and some other public polling, you'd probably rather be in Vice President Kamala Harris's shoes than in Donald Trump's.
I wonder if she's still going to be trying to paint herself as the underdog now with data like
It's going to
these.
be harder.
Yeah. All right. Bloomberg's Gregory Korte. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And of course, Gregory leading us right to our next topic of conversation, which is that interview that took place on CNN last night. It was not just Kamala Harris. Tim Walz was also with her. But of course, a lot of the questioning from Dana Bash of CNN was directed toward the vice president and presidential nominee. Here's a sampling of how it went.
My agenda includes what we need to do to bring down the price of groceries. For example, dealing with an issue like price gouging. What we need to do to extend the child tax credit to help young families be able to take care of their children in their most formative years. What we need to do to bring down the cost of housing. And I made that clear on the debate stage in 2020, that I would not ban fracking. As vice president, I did not ban fracking. As president, I will not ban fracking. There should be consequence. We have laws that have to be followed and enforced, that address and deal with people who cross our border illegally. And I think it would be to the benefit of the American public to have a member of my cabinet who was a Republican. We have to get a deal done. This war must end. In the meantime, and we must get a deal that is about getting the hostages out. I've met with the families of the American hostages. Let's get the hostages out. Let's get the ceasefire done.
The question is, did Kamala Harris change any minds for better or worse with that interview last night? So for an answer to that, let's turn now to Jeanne Hall. She is American University Associate Professor of Journalism and Media Studies and also author of Politics and the Media, Intersections and New Directions. Jeanne, welcome back to Bloomberg. You are a professor. What grade would you give Kamala Harris when it comes to her interview performance?
You know, I would give her an A-. I think that she did well. I think that clearly her messaging on the points that she made about the economy, although she didn't start out that way. Dana asked her a question about what would you do day one, which is kind of a gotcha question. She came back to it and talked about what you had the soundbite from. And I think that messaging of I will be there for you, I will help you, I will restore the middle class. And these are some specifics. She's been hammered over not having enough specifics. She has specifics, and I think she legislated that very well. And I do think also it was very interesting. You know, I'm a student of women and gender issues and politics and media. It was very interesting the way she handled herself, the table she was at, the fact that Tim Walz was with her. I noticed Trump said he didn't think she looked like a leader. I think it's because he would have had a crown. You know, he would have had something else. He would have asked for more trappings. And I think that's an interesting choice, that she was with him and yet she was in charge. You're clearly trying to say, it's okay, guys, you know, this is how this can work.
Well, but to the point about this being a joint interview, them together at the table, they weren't, you know, sitting in typically the soft seating you would kind of see in interviews like this. She had her arms up on the table at many points in the interview, while Tim Walz sat, for the most part, quietly beside her. He, of course, didn't field as many questions. Do you think his presence there really served a purpose, or was it actually detrimental to what Harris may have wanted to accomplish?
You know, I think it worked. I think if he had too many questions, people would have said, why did she need, quote unquote, to bring him? This is not the first joint interview that has been done. The critics of this have said that this was her first big interview, so why did she bring him? But I think they are counting on the visual framing and the visual messaging that here is a guy who is sitting there, and he was deferential to her, and yet when he was asked, when he was pressed on some things, he spoke up. I think it worked. It's interesting, it was a table in a cafe. I'm not sure if I'd been her campaign, not to make too much of this, if I would have allowed it to be that casual looking. I do think the symbolism does matter, but I think it was good to have him there.
Well, and it wasn't just a cafe. It was a Black-owned cafe in Georgia specifically, Jeanne. And on the subject of color, of course, this is something that Kamala Harris hasn't been super forward with in her candidacy. She hasn't really leaned on the historic nature of being a woman of color who is leading a major party's presidential ticket. And she also didn't really play ball when she was questioned about the way Donald Trump has characterized her racial identity. Let's just remind ourselves of that very brief Q&A last night.
He suggested that you happened to turn black recently for political purposes, questioning a core part of your identity.
Yeah.
Any
Same old tired playbook. Next question, please.
That's it?
That's it.
Did not engage with it hardly at all. Jeanne, what do you make of that strategy?
I have to say that it's clearly a strategy, and it is apparently clearly the way she feels and the way she's comported herself her whole life. I think, frankly, it's somewhat risky to not engage at all. I think the hope is, and what I'll be interested to see is, what does he do on that debate stage? I mean, you have a split screen in what he has been saying about her in rallies and what he has been posting. And I would imagine the hope is that women will be so turned off, and Republican women, Democratic women are so turned off by his stances on reproductive rights, but also the way he has been trashing her, the way that J.D. Vance has said she can go to hell over commentary she didn't even do over the cemetery incident. I think it's a strategy, probably the way she has conducted herself. I don't know if you should say, I'm never going to talk about it. Women and women of color have to prove their accomplishments, and that is something that she knows. And I think that's what they're leaning on, and they're hoping that he will do the dirty work for her, frankly, be so racist in his commentary, and that will be publicized, and that's all she has to do. I frankly would have liked to have seen some sort of a sense of what does it feel like to be the first. She was asked about it with that wonderful photograph of her great niece. And in my view, she hesitated a little as to whether she was going to talk about it, the little girl in pigtails looking up. She said she was very moved. But again, I think she has just decided, and they've decided, we're not going there. I'm not sure that's going to work in the debate. And we'll see what happens in the debate in terms of what is quoted back to him and what does she need to respond to.
Well, Jeanne, might that also depend on whether or not the mics stay hot the whole time or are muted like we saw in June between Trump and Biden? ABC's debate rules say the mics will be muted. We don't know yet that the Harris campaign has agreed to that. They want them hot.
Well, I think I was on with you all before the debate, and I think I was out there saying, I think that the mics being muted would allow him to, and also no audience, would allow him to stay presidential for, and play by the rules, literally, for the time that was needed. This was for the Biden debate, of course. I think it serves them for him to lose it, in a sense, to not stay on policy. Certainly, she's going to question him about, how are you now talking about how you're going to have free IVF treatments when what you've done is overturn Roe v. Wade? I mean, she can go after him on policy, but I think it doesn't help her as much as it would help him to have the mics muted.
Well, I guess we'll see if agreement is reached on that. Finally, Jeanne, we have less than a minute left, but how are you thinking about the earned media race here? The idea that Donald Trump really dominated that in election cycles we've seen him compete in the past, but this kind of feels different, doesn't it?
Oh, I think that's such a good point. I mean, he got he didn't have to spend nearly as much because he got incredible free media. She is getting the free media. That convention was absolutely perfected to reframe choice and reframe freedom and seize back patriotism. I mean, those are the kind of ads they're doing. She is handling this very well in terms of media. And, the other thing that I think is interesting in terms of media, she could go do local interviews. I would imagine they are going to do local interviews. I thought Dana did a fine job. But I think she's continuing to get a honeymoon in the media too.
Well, of course, we're hoping she'll come talk to us, as we're hoping Donald Trump will here on Bloomberg. Thanks for joining us, Jeanne Hall of American University. Appreciate your time. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Happy Friday to everyone as we mark the last Friday of what I guess we unofficially call summer. It's hard to believe that Labor Day is already upon us, especially considering the summer we have had in American politics. It's been probably unlike any summer in modern American political history. If we remember back to Memorial Day, this was still a race, the longest general election cycle we'd seen in modern history, between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. By June 27th, that fateful CNN debate between the two, where calls started to begin for Joe Biden to drop out of the race. And then, of course, on the eve of the Republican convention on July 13th, Donald Trump was shot in an attempted assassination attempt. 2 days later, he announced J.D. Vance as his running mate at the RNC. And just days after that ended, on July 21st, Joe Biden did it. He left the race and endorsed Kamala Harris, who within days had essentially locked up the Democratic nomination. She, of course, just wrapped up the convention in Chicago last week with Tim Walz, her running mate, at her side. And in the 6 weeks since she became the candidate, we have seen a big change in this race. Not only in terms of the fundraising game, she's crossed the $500 million threshold as of last week, but she's made dramatic changes in polling as well, doing far better than Joe Biden was at the point he left the race and gaining ground against Donald Trump in some of the key battleground states. At least that's what our latest polling indicates. Bloomberg, together with Morning Consult, taking a look at those 7 swing states and finding Harris ahead of Trump by 2 points on average across them. So for more on that, let's turn to Eli Yokley, Morning Consult's U.S. politics analyst, who joins us every poll period. We've, of course, had 11 of these at this point, Eli, so we're getting used to talking to you. Thank you for being here on this Friday. Of course, we're within the margin of error in a number of these states. Not so in Wisconsin, though, where she's up 8 points. But broadly, this paints a picture of a wider map for Harris.
Yeah. I mean, things are much better for Kamala Harris than they were for Joe Biden. That sounds almost obvious to say, but your explanation of what happened this summer is right. I mean, it was a dramatic shift in the American political landscape, and voters noticed. Kamala Harris is on better footing than Joe Biden ever was across every single one of these states. That's the good news for Democrats. The challenge for them, the advantage or the possibility for Trump maybe, is the fact that a lot of these states are really, really close. I mean, Arizona's tied. Georgia's basically tied. Michigan's close. North Carolina and Nevada are pretty close. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Kamala Harris looks to be in an okay position, but those are also tight races. This contest isn't over. Maybe it was over before Joe Biden left the race, but that's what's changed in the last few weeks. This is a real race.
Yeah, which indicates that it's going to be rough and tumble for the next 60-something days, Eli, leading up to Election Day. When we consider, though, the idea that even though these are still incredibly tight margins, she is outpolling where Joe Biden was, what do we attribute that to? Is this Democratic voters who are more likely to turn out for a different candidate? Is this independents who seem to have been swayed from being potentially a double hater to at least tolerating her? Is this other demographics like Black voters, Latinos? What does the breakdown of the data show us?
It's all of the above. I mean, look, Joe Biden's problem when he was in the contest was he was not performing as well with his own 2020 voters as Donald Trump was. Kamala Harris has reversed that. We're seeing what everybody's calling a vibes shift happen in this contest. And one of the questions we asked in this survey kind of underscores that. We asked voters if they were voting. We asked Democratic presidential candidate supporters if they were voting for the candidate or against Trump. And when we asked about Harris this time around, they were 15 points more likely across the swing state map to ascribe that positive motivator to their vote than they were to Biden when we asked back in April. I mean, we were all at our Democratic National Convention in Chicago. We saw the energy in that room of core activist supporters. But, we're seeing that across the country. She was down in southern Georgia. There were lines in that rural community around the blocks trying to go see her. Clearly, something is happening there. She's getting so much positive media attention that is breaking through to the public. I mean, we've not necessarily seen a convention bump, and that's probably because she got her bump already when she launched her campaign after Joe Biden dropped out.
Well, fair enough. Maybe she already peaked, if you will, but it does seem that at least that peak has turned into a plateau rather than something that has gone back down the hill. Eli, I also want to zero in on the findings here regarding the economy and specific economic issues, including help for the middle class and housing, where it's not just that Harris is doing better than Joe Biden was on those issues. She is outpolling Donald Trump. What do you make of that? And where within the kind of economic indicators is Donald Trump still clearly ahead, knowing he has been trying hard to campaign on this issue?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing going for Donald Trump is the fact that the voters' perceptions of how the economy is performing haven't really changed very much. I mean, when Joe Biden was in the race, 72% said it was on the wrong track. Now 69% say that. The folks who see prices as increasing across the swing state map have not improved. That's clearly an advantage for Donald Trump. What Kamala Harris has seen is she is not totally associated with Joe Biden being in the White House as one might expect. I mean, she has seen her trust over Donald Trump in a better place than Joe Biden's was when it comes to the economy. I think she halved Donald Trump's lead on the economy in our swing state tracking. It's not just the economy, by the way. I mean, we're seeing that about every single issue. Voters are much happier about her. They're disassociating her with the negativity that they associated with Joe Biden. You're right about Kamala Harris on issues like housing. That's clearly a good issue for Democrats this year. If Donald Trump can focus on the inflation issue, though, there is wide appetite among the swing state electorate for him to talk about that. The problem with his campaign, this has been the problem since he's been on the political stage, is he gets into sideshows. I mean, he spent the week fighting with Arlington National Cemetery this week. That's not going to be a winning message for an electorate hungry for answers about inflation.
Well, and maybe we'll get more of those answers leading up to the debate or on the debate stage on September 10th. Eli, if we consider the kind of themes we're likely to hear from these candidates, and frankly, we heard Kamala Harris sitting many of these themes, including housing in the middle class last night in that interview on CNN. Something else that she has talked a lot about and really dominated the convention in Chicago last week is this idea around freedoms, not just reproductive freedom, but others as well. And it was striking to see here swing state voters trust her on that issue as well by a 5-point margin. This is kind of a departure of the way that Democrats and Republicans usually can lay claim to the freedom issue.
I know. I spent so much time in the early 2010s at Tea Party rallies talking about freedom with a bunch of conservatives. I think that Kamala Harris has done a lot of work, maybe with Beyonce's help, to try to reclaim the mantle of freedom for the Democratic Party. I think a lot of that discussion has been centered around abortion rights, and that is a big issue for a number of swing state voters. It's not the number one issue for a lot of people, but it is for a number of people. And those are core kind of Democratic voters. And her advantage on that issue is massive. She leads Trump by 21 points on that issue. That's clearly a good issue for her. And I think we've seen a lot of coverage recently of Donald Trump realizing it's not a good issue for him. I think it's been very clear since the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade abortion rights that Donald Trump has been not wanting to engage on that issue as much as possible. I think that Democrats, I think that the state of Florida is going to make it where he's going to have to. And I think that's going to be a topic of discussion at the debate where we're really going to see some news develop.
Yeah, Donald Trump not really ready with an answer yet as to how exactly he's voting on that 6-week abortion issue in Florida, where, of course, he will be casting his vote. I do want to ask finally, Eli, because we've talked a lot about the people leading the ticket, Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, but they do have running mates who have been out there. Tim Walz was with her in that interview on CNN last night. This, of course, is a poll done now that we know that he is running beside her. How is Walz factoring in to the calculus for Harris and J.D. Vance for Trump, for that matter?
Well, Tim Walz is very popular. I think Kamala Harris, who's also very popular, more popular than Joe Biden or Donald Trump have been since we started tracking this back in 2022. Tim Walz pretty much matches her popularity. I think that makes him a very good campaign asset. And it's with all sorts of groups. It's with men, it's with women, it's with voters of color, it's with white people. Tim Walz is a good asset. J.D. Vance, I don't know how much his candidacy probably matters here. I mean, Donald Trump steals the show. It is a Trump show when they're out and about. The little asides get a lot of attention online. Some of J.D. Vance's campaign missteps. I don't know that those are going to like rock the world here, given that Donald Trump is at the top of the ticket. But on the other side of the ballot, I mean, Kamala Harris found a good running mate who can be an asset on the campaign trail in Governor Tim Walz.
All right, and we expect we'll hear more from both of them, like we did last night, throughout the course of the next 60-some days. Same goes for Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. And we'll be hearing, of course, more from Eli Yokley, I'm sure. We still have 2 polls to go this election cycle. We'll have more in September, in October. Eli Yokley of Morning Consult, thank you so much for joining me. And I'll be joined now by our political panel. Want to get some more reaction to this data. Jeanne Zaino is with me. She's political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Together today with Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Lisa, just to come to you on that ending note there, the idea of the role that the vice presidential candidates, the running mates, are playing here. Now that we are more than a month out from the selection of J.D. Vance, we're only weeks out at this point from the selection of Tim Walz. How do you view whether or not they are adding or detracting to the tickets they're representing?
You know, it's interesting to me for both sides that really Donald Trump and what was just what you all were just discussing is absolutely true. Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and he is probably bigger than life in all of those circumstances. So J.D. Vance, while not really making very much of an impact one way or the other, not necessarily detracting from him because people are really voting for Trump. But on the Democrat side, it's actually quite interesting. I think that what's interesting to me as we look at this ticket is that we're getting to know both of these candidates at the very same time. And Tim Walz is very likable as it relates to just the way he approaches the audiences and the groups that he's connecting with, the people that he's speaking with. He's very authentic. And that is the difference between those two number 2 candidates, is that J.D. Vance, I think, is still trying to figure out who he is. And Tim Walz very much knows who he is and what his brand is. And so that's kind of interesting. But more than ever, I mean, I think that we're meeting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz at the same time, whereas we know who Donald Trump is and we don't really know very much about J.D. Vance other than sort of what we read and what we see. The two of them together are very different, but also very similar in that regardless, people are voting for the number 1 candidate, but the number 2 on the Democrat side, I think, is very much helping more than J.D. Vance is helping Donald Trump.
Well, so to this point, Jeanne, of course, we did this poll knowing Tim Walz was running with Kamala Harris. And when he was selected, everybody was like, okay, well, he's from Minnesota. He has that Midwestern appeal that could work in the Rust Belt. He also had a rural upbringing and was a gun owner and things that may be able to help resonate in other areas. To what extent do you think that is actually showing up in these polls across the string states with that 8-point margin in Wisconsin, for example, and frankly, the lead Harris now has in Georgia and North Carolina?
You know, I think it can be showing up, particularly in a place like Wisconsin, his neighboring state. Traditionally, all of our research shows that vice presidents, as much attention as we give them on the ballot, don't make that much of a difference. So I'm not sure it's making that much of a difference now. But what I would say is you have to imagine, what if Donald Trump hadn't had to choose J.D. Vance before Harris was at the top of the ticket? If he had gone with somebody else, you know, J.D. Vance, he doubled down on the far right of the party. If he had gone with, say, a Nikki Haley or even somebody like a Tulsi Gabbard or somebody else, how different this election might be, particularly in issues involving women and women's reproductive health. So, you know, I think poor Donald Trump had, you know, the misfortune of having to make a decision before he knew who he was opposing. And I dare say he would have gone in a different direction given the issues he's confronting now with Kamala Harris.
Well, and on just the idea of the issues and what Donald Trump has continually brought up in his attacks against Kamala Harris, not the personal ones, but the policy ones, issues like the border, and of course, the economy. We've spoken about how this poll does show that Harris is polling better on some economic elements like housing and the middle class than Donald Trump is at this point. Lisa, if that is true, where are the best messaging areas for Donald Trump to hit her on? Is it still going to be the economy, or does this suggest maybe he just needs to double down on the border or something else?
Well, I mean, Kailey, to the point that I think Jeanne just made, and to add on to what I said earlier, this is a base election. Each one of them picked a candidate for their number two that very much speaks to the base of the various parties. And so regardless of whether it's immigration or it's the economy or anything else, each one of those candidates on either side of the aisle will have to talk about issues that will motivate and excite the base to get out and vote. And so, yes, I think that immigration is one that continues to motivate and get the base out on the Republican side. Talking about economic issues for each one of them is very, very important. This is absolutely going to come down to turnout, and it's going to come down to support, because there is such a slim margin of people that are undecided and haven't figured out who they want to support, that they're going to have to figure out a way to talk about the issues as it relates to immigration, the economy, or otherwise, in a way that appeals not only to who the people that are already coming out for them, but that slim margin. And that's going to be very difficult for either one of them, because until they can figure that, whoever figures that out, Kailey, is the one who's going to win.
All right, Lisa Camooso Miller and Jeanne Zaino, my political panel today.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We are still assessing the first sit-down interview from Vice President Kamala Harris, and she became the Democratic nominee for president. She, of course, sat down for a conversation on CNN last night alongside her running mate, Tim Walz. She was faced with a number of questions surrounding policy, from domestic issues like the border and the economy to foreign policy ones, specifically when it comes to Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza. This is, of course, something that many progressives have strong feelings about, and Kamala Harris does seem to be getting more slack from that wing of the Democratic Party on this issue than the president she has served with for the last 3.5 years, Joe Biden, seen as someone who potentially is more sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. But she made it clear in the interview last night that she would not support an Israel arms embargo, which is something some are calling for. She talked about the need to continue to stand for Israel's defense, but she also pushed a ceasefire deal that she would like to see happen between Israel and Hamas.
We have got to get a deal done. We were in Doha. Mm-hmm. We have to get a deal done. This war must end.
In the meantime,
and we must get a deal that is about getting the hostages out. I've met with the families of the American hostages. Let's get the hostages out. Let's get the ceasefire done.
So for more on whether that ceasefire could get done in the state of play in the Middle East, retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt is with me now. He, of course, was in the U.S. Army, former Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Affairs. Welcome back to Bloomberg, sir. Appreciate you joining us. Obviously, the ceasefire negotiations have been ongoing for some time now, and despite the U.S. occasionally expressing optimism, it doesn't seem there's been much forward movement on what remains the key sticking point, which is whether or not it will mean a permanent Israel pullout of Gaza in terms of the military presence there. Do you really think we're getting any closer to the moment where the Israeli government's going to be willing to agree to that?
I really don't think so, because the proposal that's been put forth right now from the Israelis is that they have a resident force remaining inside of Gaza, one force which is guarding a line that blocks North Gaza from South Gaza. Gaza City and Khan Yunis would be separated. They're also looking at retaining a force along what is known as the Philadelphi corridor, which separates Gaza from Egypt because of concerns with regards to the tunneling that is being done by Hamas. So it's hard to see that either side is either willing and candidly at this point able to agree to a ceasefire that would also include the return of the hostages. So I think we're just going to see no breakthroughs anytime soon.
Well, we are going to see, though, it seems, breaks in the fighting, at least for short periods of time over the course of 3 days, beginning on September 1st. The UN has said Israel has agreed to that in order to provide polio vaccines to the young population in Gaza. Israel has said very clearly this is not the start of a wider ceasefire, but part of the conversation we'd had around the initial ceasefire much closer to October 7th that we saw when we were still in the earlier days of this conflict was whether or not it allowed Hamas, breaks in the fighting allowed Hamas to kind of recalibrate and reconstitute themselves. Do you think there's an opportunity for that, or how depleted is Hamas now that they may not even be able to do that in short windows of time?
Well, first of all, Hamas has demonstrated a tenacity, which I think surprises everybody. And when you're talking about reconstituting, that doesn't really take a lot of effort on the part of Hamas because the remaining resident forces that they have are pretty well hunkered down in the tunnels primarily. But it's also important to note that that couple of days allows Israel to reconstitute some of its forces, not necessarily to go back into Gaza or to continue fighting in Gaza, but to get them up to the northern border because of the worries and concerns about a ground operation either coming into or going from Lebanon, an attack by Hezbollah or an attack by the Israelis into Lebanon. So that gives them time. Their troops are pretty worn out as well. And if Israel wants to take on or is forced to take on Hezbollah, they're going to need some reconstitution time as well.
Well, while we watch the border with Lebanon, we're also watching, sir, the West Bank, as Israel this week has begun operations there. They killed 5 Palestinian gunmen there yesterday. It's been described, as was the strike against the Hezbollah targets over this past weekend, as something that is preemptive. They're trying to ward off imminent threats. But could the preemptive action still be something that is escalatory?
Oh, certainly. In fact, the great concern that a lot of people have, including myself, is all these preemptive actions put Hamas, Hezbollah, the West Bank, the Hashid, the Houthis in a position where their pride requires them to respond to these preemptive attacks. And we might find ourselves spiraling out of control through either miscalculation, misperception, or just some mischief on the ground by some of the antagonists. So yes, it's important to have preemptive attacks when absolutely necessary. There's a question about where that bar is right now between preemptive and overly preemptive.
Well, and of course, we're still awaiting the Iranian retaliation for the killing of the Hamas political leader in Tehran earlier this summer. That still hasn't materialized. Sir, I want to ask you about something else as well, because it is August 30th. We are marking today 3 years since the official pullout of United States forces from Afghanistan. Of course, a withdrawal that was in many ways chaotic and, of course, left 13 service members dead when we consider the suicide bombing at the airport, which Donald Trump was marking earlier this week. To what extent the conversation we're now having about the Middle East, to what extent is that shaped by the events of 3 years ago, when Donald Trump suggests that it was the withdrawal from Afghanistan that has precipitated a lot of the conflict we have seen in the years since? Do you think that's a fair statement?
I would question the linkage between what happened in Afghanistan and what is happening in Gaza. However, I don't think there's any doubt that the shambolic withdrawal from Afghanistan emboldened Vladimir Putin to conduct the attack into Ukraine. I think there's more direct linkage between Afghanistan and Ukraine than there is between Afghanistan and Gaza.
Okay, so you do see some linkage there. What is the linkage then to what's happening in Ukraine? This is primarily a Russia thing?
Well, I think the most important thing is that President Putin may have perceived that there would not be an American response, that America was tired of fighting in these, quote, endless wars, that 20 years after fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the United States, and for that matter, NATO nations, wouldn't come to the assistance of Ukraine if it was intact. And so he may have put into his calculations that a very low probability that a country that would run away from Afghanistan would be willing to stand behind Ukraine. And as it turns out, Vladimir Putin was wrong.
Well, certainly he may have been wrong about Joe Biden, but do you think Vladimir Putin would be as wrong in that if Donald Trump becomes president once again? Do you believe that Donald Trump won't walk away from Ukraine?
I think President Trump, if he is reelected, will be looking for a negotiated settlement. I'm not sure that Ukraine will like the terms of that, but this war has gone on for quite a few years, and both sides seem to be wearing down. And I think anybody at this point would want to see some sort of end to the conflict. The question, of course, is what are the terms of that conflict termination? Who is advantaged by that? Who wins? Who declares victory? I think what Donald Trump is saying is that he can find a middle ground. That, as Senator Akins said about Vietnam, they can both just declare victory and go home.
Well, of course, we did learn today that Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is planning to pitch another peace summit in India and wants to talk with Joe Biden next month at the UN General Assembly about a path to ending this war. I do, though, sir, want to ask you something else about Donald Trump. Of course, when he was marking the 3-year anniversary of the deaths of 13 service members earlier this week, he was at Arlington Cemetery. He was in Section 60, in an area where photography is not allowed, especially for political purposes. And we understand, based on a report on the matter from the Defense Department, that a Trump aide actually shoved, although the Trump campaign maintains that this was not a physical altercation, shoved someone who was trying to get them to stop taking photographs. Sir, how does that reflect on someone who's trying once again to be commander-in-chief?
Well, I think if we do a forensic examination of what happened, first of all, I think it's certainly within his prerogative, and in many ways, he should honor the families that lost their troops inside of Afghanistan at the Abbey Gate and elsewhere. He did come at the request of the families, but there is a concern that he may have gone over the line, and probably did go over the line, or his campaign aides went over the line. When this went from being an event to console the families to an event that possibly could show up in a campaign ad. I think it's great when presidents, former presidents, anybody goes and honors our dead troops that have given so much. But when they want to leverage that into campaign advantage and use that on the campaign trail, I think that's when he has gone over the line. And either he, in planning it, or he, in his campaign ads, taking advantage of it. This Arlington is not a place that should be used for campaign ads. As people say, you can't come into Arlington by request. You only come in there because you've served this country.
Finally, sir, on the subject of service, because that is something else that has arisen in this campaign when it comes to Kamala Harris's running mate, Tim Walz, who, of course, served more than 20 years in the National Guard, did not, however, deploy to an active combat zone, despite his suggestion that he once carried a weapon of war in war. He was asked about that on CNN last night. He talked about his misuse of proper grammar, essentially. Were you satisfied by the answer you got from the governor of Minnesota?
Listen, I don't want to take an opinion on that. He has been a great public servant over the years, both in the National Guard and in the school system. His motivations for why he retired at that time, fully understanding, if not having a deployment order, but certainly understanding that his unit probably would have been deployed. What went on in his mind at that time, I think he is the only one that can answer that. And again, I just don't like it when military service and military funerals are used for political purposes. That whole subject and that whole issue should be not personalized, nor it should be politicized. Our service members serve this country. They don't serve political parties. So let's get that out of the conversation as we go into the election season.
All right. Wise words. Appreciate your perspective, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. Retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. Appreciate your time.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
you so much. I'm Kailey Leinz here in Washington. Welcome back to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. That's right. Labor Day weekend is upon us. We just have a few working hours to go before the holiday weekend, in which a lot of people will be traveling. If the forecasts are to be believed, many of them, of course, traveling by car. And the good news, I guess, for drivers is that gas prices are lower going into this Labor Day weekend than they were this holiday weekend last year. Of course, back then we were looking at $3.80 and above on the average AAA gas price across the country. Now, as we stand here at the end of August, $3.35 a gallon is what you'll pay at the pump. But we want to get into the dynamics we're seeing in gasoline prices a little bit more as we look ahead to this holiday and, of course, beyond it, a presidential election in which prices at the pump could matter quite a lot. So we turn now to Patrick de Haan. He is GasBuddy's head of Petroleum Analysis. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio, Patrick. Always great to have you. So we look obviously at the average Labor Day weekend price being down nearly 50 cents from last year. Is this a trajectory that you see continuing once the summer driving season officially comes to an end?
Yeah, Kailey, I think it is a solid trajectory. As you mentioned, price is almost 50 cents a gallon lower than last year. That's a 13% chopping block. And while the disinflation has hit gasoline and diesel, it's still not hitting other areas of the economy. And that's why demand this summer has been relatively weak. And that's why we expect that this downward trend will continue. We got a little bit of a shot in the arm for that as well. Today, OPEC rumored to be considering raising its production, sticking with its plan, which is a bit of a surprise, but we certainly could see more and more gas prices below the $3 a gallon mark. GasBuddy data showing 8 states where average gas prices are below $3 a gallon for Labor Day. That number could double or even triple by the time we get to Halloween or into Thanksgiving.
Okay, well, so that, of course, puts us, if we're talking Halloween, just on the cusp of the presidential election. So where exactly do you think the average price will be come November 5th, Patrick?
Certainly a good possibility. We could be just teetering on the $3 a gallon mark, potentially falling below it. Now, there are some contingencies, some caveats. You could say the typical caveats apply. Hurricane season has been relatively quiet, but we are in the prime. There are a couple of areas of interest that the National Hurricane Center is monitoring. And of course, the other wild card, the Middle East. Tensions right now de-escalating a bit, but there's always the possibility that there could be new violence between Israel and Hamas or Hezbollah or Iran. And so that could be a wild card. But I think there's a pretty solid chance that if not by Halloween, the national average could fall below the $3 a gallon mark by Thanksgiving.
Well, that certainly is something to consider as we think about the political consequences of that. On the subject of politics, there, of course, is an argument that's being made by Donald Trump when he is talking about what he wants to do to get inflation down. Frequently, Patrick, his answer is drill, baby, drill. Of course, as we consider where prices are right now, it is against a backdrop of record oil production in the U.S. How much would drilling more, pumping more, matter actually to gasoline prices if we're still considering refining margins here? And frankly, oil companies, by and large, still have tried to maintain capital discipline. They're not really seeking to pump more, right?
Yeah, Kailey, exactly right. It's taken a long time for us to reach this 13.4 million barrel a day territory, really since COVID. And as you mentioned, this has been a very calm, cool, and collected environment that oil producers have raised production. Now, keep in mind, on the other side of things, OPEC is getting a little bit, well, some OPEC members rather are getting a little bit tired of those production cuts that OPEC announced last year. And so OPEC is poised to bring some of that back. The other wild card, too, for President Trump saying drill, baby, drill. Again, the U.S. is not a state-owned oil company. There's only so many incentives you can give oil companies to do what would be against their interest, and raising production, which could potentially undermine the cost of oil and drive it down. The other factor that's really interesting is Trump's potential play when it comes to tariffs, promising maybe 20% tariffs. Keep in mind, the U.S. produces millions of barrels a day of oil from Canada. Those tariffs could send gas prices skyrocketing in areas of the Midwest if President Trump is serious.
Is there an equivalent 20% tariff cent figure at the pump, or a relationship between the two? How much realistically do you think that could increase gas prices in the worst case scenario?
Well, a 20% increase might today represent a $15 a barrel jump. That $15 a barrel divided by 42 is not an insignificant number. That could boost gas prices theoretically in the ballpark of 15 to 35 cents a gallon, it would be contingent on season. The bigger increase if the tariffs were established would be when gasoline demand is highest and when refineries need to kick out supply. So that's not something small. And when we're talking about the difference between $3 gas and $2.80 gas, that could be a differentiator there that President Trump may risk the ire of folks, especially in the Great Lakes, which is the market that Canadian oil is the beneficiary to. Great Lakes refiners predominantly produce oil derived from Canadian crude. So that could be problematic in areas of the Midwest.
Well, I also have to consider as well, when he's talking about tariffs, but well beyond 20%, potentially 60% on all goods coming from China, which is obviously a massive trade partner, can not only have ramifications for the economy at home in terms of higher costs, but could be very detrimental to China's own economy, which already is struggling. How much of the lower prices we're seeing, Patrick, are because of weakness in the second largest economy?
Certainly a big portion of the discussion this year has been a lack of consumption in China, where they're likely continuing to fill their strategic reserve. And once that's done, if their economy can't get off the ground, we could be looking at a real struggle for crude oil. And that's why it's interesting that OPEC would be choosing now to potentially raise production. The U.S. economy may start to improve, but in China, it's been a difficult guessing game on throwing things at the wall and to see what will boost the Chinese economy. Nothing's really worked just yet. So, if China remains in this economic slowdown, it's going to have a profound impact on oil moving forward. Arguably, it could offset the potential impact from some of these tariffs that Trump had outlined.
Well, of course, as we consider what China is doing to stimulate its own economy, there could be more stimulative monetary policy coming in the U.S. pretty soon. The Fed is expected to cut rates in September. And if markets are to be believed, they could cut a whole 100 basis points by the time the year is over. Do you expect that there's going to be a demand translation from lower rates when it comes to prices at the pumps? Or if this is happening in the fall and winter seasons, will it not matter as much?
Yeah, it probably won't be as significant as cutting rates or having lower rates in a more conducive environment, a spring or summer when Americans are feeling much better about getting out because of low interest rates. I think that would be the primary time of year that there would be a windfall when it comes to gasoline demand. Right now, with schools reopening, Americans are back to the grind, back to their normal Monday through Friday commute. And there's not a whole lot of uptick. Now, it could mean some Americans feel better. They may take some fall road trips, some foliage color tours, but I think there's a lot more opportunity next spring and summer. Should the economy slow down, Americans may start to feel better about their prospects, and that could raise demand going into 2025.
All right, Patrick, really appreciate the analysis. Great to have you on this Labor Day weekend eve. Patrick Haan is GasBuddy's head of petroleum analysis.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.